The morning came without warning. February 9th, 1960, a Tuesday. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees as dawn crept across the Front Range, the peaks of the Rockies still holding the last blue shadows of night. Along Turkey Creek, southwest of Morrison, Colorado, the landscape lay silent beneath a skin of frost. The road leading to the one-lane wooden bridge was little traveled at that hour, a secondary route winding through the foothills, used mainly by ranchers and the occasional delivery truck. At approximately 8:15 in the morning, a milkman named Harold Kelso steered his truck toward the bridge. He had been making this route for years, and he knew the rhythms of these roads, the patterns of the people who lived along them. What he did not expect was an obstruction. A cream-colored International Travelall station wagon sat motionless in the middle of the bridge, blocking passage entirely. The engine was running. The radio played softly through the closed windows, but the vehicle was empty. Kelso honked his horn. Once, twice, 3 times. No response came from the surrounding pines, from the creek below, from the open meadows beyond. He stepped out of his truck, walked toward the abandoned vehicle, and felt the first unsettling pull of something wrong. On the planks of the bridge, near the driver's side door, he noticed a stain, reddish-brown, still damp in the freezing air. A hat lay on the edge of the riverbank below. Within hours, local authorities identified the station wagon. It belonged to Adolph Coors III, the 44-year-old chairman and chief executive of the Adolph Coors Brewing Company, the man who had, that very morning, kissed his wife Mary goodbye at their ranch home less than a mile from where his car now sat. He had been driving to work at the brewery in Golden, as he did every day, taking the quiet route he preferred. He never arrived. By noon, search parties had fanned out across the foothills. FBI agents joined local police, their presence signaling the gravity of what investigators feared: kidnapping. The following day, a typewritten ransom note arrived at the Coors residence. It demanded $500,000 for the safe return of Adolph Coors III. It warned against police involvement. It gave instructions for the delivery. But no further communication came. No telephone call. No proof of life. The silence stretched into days, then weeks. Spring arrived, and still Adolph Coors III had not been found. Summer came and went, and Mary Coors lived suspended between hope and grief, waiting for a husband who had vanished into the thin mountain air. Then, on September 11, 1960, 7 months after his disappearance, a hiker named Edward Lee Green Jr. stumbled upon a pair of trousers in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains, near Pikes Peak. In the pocket, a penknife bearing the engraved initials, AC. Days later, skeletal remains were recovered nearby, a shirt with bullet holes in the back, a skull that would be matched through dental records to the missing heir. Adolph Coors III had not been held captive. He had been dead since the morning he vanished, shot twice in the back, his body abandoned in the wilderness. The official account assembled itself with the methodical precision of a federal investigation. A suspect emerged: Joseph Corbett, Jr., a former Fulbright scholar and escaped convict with a prior murder conviction, who had been living in Denver under an alias. Forensic evidence linked him to the crime: soil samples from his burned-out yellow Mercury, the typeface of the ransom note traced to his typewriter, witnesses who placed him near the bridge on that February morning. Corbett was captured in Vancouver, British Columbia, in October 1960, tried in Colorado, and convicted of first-degree murder the following spring. He was sentenced to life in prison. The case, by all official measures, was closed. But the questions that lingered were never spoken aloud, not in the press conferences or the courtroom proceedings, not in the carefully composed statements issued by the Coors family. Why had a man of such methodical planning, a man who had stalked Adolph Coors for years, who had researched kidnapping with academic rigor, allowed the abduction to fail so catastrophically at its first moment? Why had Coors resisted? And how had a scuffle on a remote bridge escalated so quickly to murder? Why had Corbett, after the killing, still mailed the ransom note, as though the plan might somehow continue? And beneath these questions lay older ones, unspoken within the family, buried beneath decades of discipline and silence. The Coors dynasty had been touched by violent death before. The patriarch himself, Adolph Coors Sr., had fallen from a sixth-floor hotel window in Virginia Beach in 1929, a death-ruled suicide without autopsy or inquest. His grandson, Adolph Coors Jr., had nearly been kidnapped in 1933. The family lived with a wariness bred into their bones, a suspicion of outsiders that shaped every decision, every relationship, every public appearance. And yet, on the morning of February 9, 1960, the third-generation heir had driven alone, without security, along a road he traveled every day, a road someone else had been watching. The Coors mansion still stands on the brewery grounds in Golden, a Victorian structure built in 1890 by the founder for his wife Louisa, surrounded now by the towering steel tanks of the modern production facility. The family refers to it as the Big House. Its 22 rooms preserve the furniture, the books, the chandelier imported from Copenhagen, a museum of an earlier era, kept private, open only to blood relations. Within those walls, the story of the Coors family is told in whispers, in silences, in the careful omission of certain names. But no wall is thick enough to contain what happened on that bridge, or what it revealed about the fragility hiding beneath the dynasty's granite facade. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. He was born Adolf Hermann Joseph Coors in Barmen, a textile town in Rhenish Prussia, on February 4, 1847. His father, Joseph Coors, worked as a mill supervisor. His mother, Helena Heim, kept the household. They were people of modest means in an industrial region along the Rhine, working class, practical, unremarkable. The boy grew up in the clatter of looms and the grey light of factory smoke, in a world where labor began early and softness was a liability. At 13, he was apprenticed to a stationer in the nearby town of Ruhrort, learning the trade of printing and binding. It was expected. Boys of his station did not attend university or dream of professions. They learned with their hands, and they worked until their bodies failed. Then, in the spring of 1862, his mother died. Helena Coors was 42 years old. The cause was illness, tuberculosis by some accounts, though the records are imprecise. The family moved to Dortmund that same year, seeking a new beginning. 7 months later, in November, his father followed his mother into the ground. Joseph Coors was also 42. The boy was 15 years old, and he was alone. He and his 2 younger siblings, a sister and a brother named William, were placed in the care of a Catholic orphanage. The institution provided shelter, discipline, and the cold comfort of routine. Whatever grief the boy carried, he buried it deep. He did not speak of his parents in the years that followed, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone who recorded his words for posterity. The silence began there, in Dortmund, in the winter of 1862. Before his parents' deaths, the boy had already begun a new apprenticeship at the Heinrich Wencker Brewery, across the street from his family's home. He was charged a fee for the training, so he worked as a bookkeeper on the side to pay for it. After the orphanage claimed him, he continued his apprenticeship, mastering the craft of brewing with the same grim determination that would define the rest of his life. By 1867, he had completed his training and spent his Wanderjahr, the traditional journeyman's year, working at breweries in Kassel, Berlin, and Uelzen. He was 21 years old in 1868 when the Prussian army came calling. The German states were restless with war. Denmark, Austria, the slow consolidation of Bismarck's ambitions. Conscription was not optional, but Adolf Coors had no intention of dying in a trench for a fatherland that had given him nothing but loss. He made his way to Hamburg and, without funds for passage, stowed away on a ship bound for America. He was discovered before the vessel reached open water. The crew offered him a choice: work off his passage upon arrival or be thrown overboard. He worked. When the ship docked in Baltimore, he was penniless, anonymous, and free. He would carry the shame of that crossing for the rest of his life. He forbade his family from ever speaking of it, the secret held for more than a century, surfacing only after his son's death in 1970. In America, he changed his name. Coors became Coors, a small adjustment, easier on the American tongue, a severing of the old world from the new. He made his way to Chicago, where he labored as a bricklayer, a stoker shoveling coal into steam engines, and finally, a brewer. By 1869, he had secured a position at the Stenger Brewery in Naperville, Illinois, where his skills earned him rapid promotion to superintendent. But he did not stay. The family stories diverge on the reason. One version holds that John Stenger intended the young German to marry one of his 3 daughters, and Coors refused. Another claims that Coors fell in love with one of the Stenger girls and was rejected. The truth, if it survives, remains buried in the silences the family cultivated. What is certain is that in 1872, Adolf Coors resigned his position and headed west, toward the mountains, toward the water, toward a place where no one knew his name or his past. He arrived in Denver in April 1872, at the age of 25. Within months, he had purchased a partnership in a bottling company. Within a year, he had found what he was looking for: an abandoned tannery on the banks of Clear Creek in Golden, Colorado, a mining town nestled beneath the mesas at the edge of the Rockies. The water ran cold and pure from the snowpack above, filtered through granite, untouched by industry. It was, he believed, perfect for brewing. On November 14, 1873, Adolf Coors and a Denver confectioner named Jacob Schuler purchased the tannery for $2,500. By February of the following year, they were producing beer. By April, they were selling it. The man who built this enterprise was not warm. Those who knew him described a figure of rigid discipline, few words, and no hobbies. He poured everything he earned back into the brewery. At family dinners, conversation was minimal, laughter rarer still. When 2 of his children died in infancy, he buried them in unmarked graves and never spoke their names. He was by all accounts cold, taciturn, deeply private, and deeply unhappy. He passed these traits down like heirlooms, encoded in the bloodline, shaping the generations that followed. The beer sold itself. That was what Adolf Coors believed, and for decades the market proved him right. In 1880, 7 years after founding the Golden Brewery, he bought out his partner Jacob Schuler and became sole proprietor. The enterprise was still modest, a converted tannery on the banks of Clear Creek, shipping barrels by mule-drawn wagon and rail to miners and settlers across the Colorado Territory. But the product found its audience. By 1887, the brewery was selling over 7,000 barrels a year. 3 years later, that figure had more than doubled. The lager won awards at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, competing against 25 other national brands. Adolf Coors had built something that would outlast him. He built it his way. The water came from Clear Creek, cold, pure, filtered through Rocky Mountain granite. He commissioned farmers to grow his barley and hops to exact specifications. He invested in technology, metal bottle caps, automated processes, expansion after expansion. And he borrowed money only once, in the late 1890s, to finance a critical upgrade. When the debt was paid, he swore he would never borrow again. He kept that vow until his death. The philosophy was simple, and it became hereditary. First, spare no expense in producing the finest product. Second, family comes first, without exception. Third, a good beer sells itself. The company spent almost nothing on advertising well into the 20th century. The Coors name spread by reputation, by word of mouth, by the quiet pride of drinkers who believed they had discovered something rare. By the time Adolf Coors incorporated the business in 1913 as the Adolf Coors Brewing and Manufacturing Company, his beer was distributed throughout Colorado. His three sons, Adolf Jr., Grover, and Herman, had all attended Cornell University, all returned to Golden, all taken positions in the family enterprise. The daughters married well, their weddings held at the mansion on the brewery grounds. The dynasty was taking shape. Then came Prohibition. Colorado went dry in 1916, 4 years before the rest of the nation followed. On December 31, 1915, Coors employees poured 391 gallons of beer into Clear Creek. The law required it. The brewery that had taken 4 decades to build fell silent. But Adolf Coors did not surrender. He had anticipated the blow and diversified accordingly. The company pivoted to malted milk, selling to candy manufacturers. It produced a near beer called Manna, with an alcohol content below the legal threshold, and it expanded into ceramics, purchasing the Herald China and Pottery Company in 1913 and establishing Coors Porcelain as a separate division. The clay deposits in Golden proved ideal for high-grade scientific and industrial ceramics, products that would eventually supply the United States government with components for missiles and space exploration. The brewery survived Prohibition not by waiting it out, but by becoming something more than a brewery. In 1923, Adolf Coors Sr. handed control of the company to his son, Adolf Jr. The founder was 76 years old, increasingly frail, increasingly withdrawn. He traveled with his wife Louisa, the Bahamas, Key West, the Virginia coast, but found no peace. The industry he had devoted his life to building had been outlawed. The craft he had mastered was forbidden. Whatever drove him forward had been stripped away. In April 1929, the family checked into the Cavalier Hotel in Virginia Beach. Adolf Sr. was 82. On the morning of June 5th, he fell from the window of his 6th-floor room. His body was found on the concrete patio below. The coroner ruled it suicide without conducting an autopsy. In his will, Coors left instructions that his hotel bill be paid in full. He offered no explanation, no farewell, no note beyond the practical matter of settling accounts. The family buried him at Crown Hill Cemetery in Wheat Ridge and did not speak publicly of the circumstances. The brewery flags flew at half-mast, and the silence that had always surrounded the Coors family thickened into something impenetrable. Adolf Jr. inherited more than the company. He inherited the temperament, the coldness, the distrust, the obsessive self-reliance. He ran the brewery with the same iron discipline his father had established. When Prohibition ended in 1933, he launched a 6-year expansion program, pushing Coors into 10 western states. Production climbed. By 1950, the brewery was producing 1 million barrels annually. The Golden facility became the largest single-site brewery in the world. But success brought exposure, and exposure brought danger. In 1933, the same year Prohibition ended, a kidnapping plot targeted Adolf Jr. himself. The scheme was connected to a broader wave of abductions sweeping the country in the wake of the Lindbergh baby case. Adolf Jr. escaped. His wealthy friend was not so fortunate, but the near miss left a permanent scar on the family psyche. From that point forward, the Coors men were required to spend their after-hours time at the family's whitewashed ranch house on company property. Security tightened. Suspicion of outsiders deepened. The walls grew higher. Adolf Jr. raised his own sons, Joseph, William, and Adolf III, under the same regimen. All 3 earned Ivy League degrees. All three worked for the family from the time they were young enough to push a handcart. They wore leather high tops and button-down shirts, no sport coats. Modesty was mandated. They shared an office with 3 metal desks. They learned from childhood that the family came first, that outsiders could not be trusted, that the business was everything. By the mid-1950s, the third generation had assumed control. Bill oversaw the brewery. Joe ran the porcelain division, and Adolf Coors III, became chairman and chief executive, the public face of the empire his grandfather had built from nothing. But the empire was changing. Labor tensions simmered. The union local, cowed after a failed strike in 1957, remained a source of friction. The family's refusal to negotiate, their insistence on polygraph tests and psychological screenings, their distrust of collective bargaining, all of it bred resentment. And beyond the brewery walls, the world was shifting in ways the Coors family seemed unwilling to see. Ad Coors moved his wife Mary and their 4 children to a ranch in the foothills near Morrison, away from the compound, away from the constant surveillance of family life. He wanted space. He wanted quiet. He wanted, perhaps, to be something other than what he had been raised to be. He had no way of knowing that someone was watching. The mansion rose where the music had once played. In the early years of the brewery, Adolf Coors had opened a beer garden on the grounds, a pleasure park for the miners and settlers who flocked to Golden for his product. There were trees and picnic tables, swings for children, ponds that froze in winter for ice making, and opened in summer for boating. A dance pavilion stood at the center of it all, and the Colorado transcript sometimes referred to the grove as the Golden Park. It was, for a time, a place of celebration, of community, of light. By 1890, the pleasure grounds had been overtaken by industry. The brewery expanded relentlessly. New buildings, new equipment, new capacity, and the park shrank into a private yard. Adolf Coors, now a millionaire, decided to build a home for his wife Louisa on the site where the dance pavilion had stood. The structure would incorporate pieces of the old hall, repurposing what had been public festivity into private sanctuary. It was, in its way, a transformation of the man himself, the immigrant who had once arrived penniless, who had slept in boarding houses and shoveled coal into steam engines, was now constructing a monument to permanence. The mansion was Victorian in style, 2 stories of eclectic frame architecture, with classical columns and Palladian windows, gabled dormers, and leaded glass, a greenhouse attached for Louisa's roses. Inside, 22 rooms unfolded, a library lined with books by German authors, parlors furnished with oriental rugs and handcrafted furniture, a music room where a Steinway piano waited for players. A chandelier imported from Copenhagen hung from the high ceiling. In a corner of the main sitting room, a round table concealed a radio near the patriarch's favorite chair, a small concession to modernity in an otherwise unchanging interior. The family called it the Big House. Denver architect Harold W. Barrison remodeled and expanded the structure in 1903, adding rooms and refining the details at Louisa's request. But the essential character of the home remained fixed. It was a vessel for the past, a declaration that the Coors family had arrived and would not leave. The German heritage was everywhere. The books, the furniture, the formality of Sunday dinners, where barely a word was spoken. The brewery surrounded the mansion on all sides, a fortress of steel and brick, and the house sat at its center like a heart wrapped in armor. Adolf Coors Sr. lived there until his death in 1929. His son, Adolf Jr., raised his own family within those walls, and when his sons married, smaller cottages were built on the grounds to keep them close. The compound grew organically, each generation adding structures, but never straying far from the original footprint. The brewery workers passed the mansion every day on their way to the fermentation cellars, but they did not enter. Only family members were permitted inside. This was not merely a home, it was a boundary, a line drawn between the Coors blood and everyone else. The insularity was deliberate. Adolf Sr. had lived through poverty, orphanhood, the shame of stowing away on a ship he could not afford. He trusted no one outside his immediate circle. His son inherited this wariness and deepened it after the 1933 kidnapping attempt that nearly claimed his life. The mansion became more than a residence. It became a philosophy made physical. The family that lived within its walls did not borrow money, did not seek outside investors, did not allow unions to gain a foothold. They controlled the water, the barley, the hops, the bottles, the trucks that carried the beer to market. They controlled, as much as any family could, their own fate. And yet the mansion also held ghosts. 2 of Adolf Sr.'s children died in infancy and were buried in unmarked graves, their names unspoken. The founder himself ended his life by falling from a hotel window 3,000 miles away, and the family never explained why. The silences accumulated in those 22 rooms, layered beneath the Oriental rugs and the German books, beneath the formal portraits and the untouched piano keys. In 1961, the brewery's expansion demanded more space, and the mansion was moved, physically lifted and relocated 300 feet to the east, then rotated 90 degrees so that it faced Castle Rock instead of the new industrial buildings. The operation was a feat of engineering, a testament to the family's refusal to demolish what the founder had built. They would not tear down the big house. They would move the earth around it instead. By then, the third generation had taken control. Bill Coors oversaw the brewery. Joe Coors ran the porcelain division, and Ad Coors, Adolf III, served as chairman and chief executive, the public face of the empire. But Ad had grown restless within the compound. He wanted space, quiet, a life that was not defined entirely by the brewery and the family name. In 1958, he moved his wife Mary and their 4 children to a ranch in the foothills near Morrison, a few miles from Golden, away from the constant surveillance of the big house. The ranch sat on 480 acres of Jefferson County prairie, with views of the Rockies and a herd of Black Angus cattle that Ad tended himself. He skied, played softball, rode horses. He crossed Turkey Creek Bridge every morning on his way to work, taking the quiet back road instead of the main highway. It was a small rebellion, a private assertion of independence from the family that had shaped him. He did not know that the bridge would become a trap. He did not know that someone had been watching his movements for years, noting his routines, waiting for the right moment. The ranch that was supposed to be his freedom would become instead the setting for his end. The mansion in Golden still stands today, surrounded by pine trees and lawns, almost lost behind the towering structures of the modern brewery complex. It is visible from Highway 58, but no tours are offered. Only family members are permitted inside, if that rule still holds. The chandelier from Copenhagen still hangs from the ceiling. The Steinway still waits in the music room. The books written by German authors still fill the shelves. And somewhere in those walls, the silences remain. Tuesday, February 9th, 1960. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees as dawn broke over the Front Range. Ad Coors rose before sunrise, as he always did, and began his daily exercise routine in the home he shared with Mary and their 4 children on the ranch near Morrison. The children ranged in age from 10 to 18. The cattle grazed on the winter-brown prairie. The Rockies stood silent against the pale sky. At approximately 8 o'clock, Ad kissed his wife goodbye and climbed into his white over turquoise International Harvester Travelall, a station wagon that automobile magazines would later identify as a precursor to the SUV. He pulled out of the driveway and turned onto the secondary road that led toward Golden, 12 miles away. It was the route he took every morning, a quiet back road that crossed Turkey Creek Bridge before connecting to the main highway. Fewer than half a dozen vehicles used the bridge each day: the local school bus, a milk delivery truck, and Coors. He never arrived at the brewery. At approximately 10 o'clock that morning, a milkman named Harold Kelso approached Turkey Creek Bridge on his delivery rounds. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, with crude wooden railings and 2 timber tracks burrowed into gravel. A station wagon sat in the middle of the span, blocking passage entirely. Its engine was running. Its radio played softly through the closed windows. Kelso honked his horn. Once, twice, several times. No response. He stepped out of his truck and walked toward the vehicle. It was empty. On the bridge planks near the driver's side door, he noticed a reddish-brown stain, still damp in the freezing air. Below the bridge, in the shallow water of Turkey Creek, he saw a hat, a brown fedora, floating near the bank. A baseball cap drifted nearby. The milkman moved the station wagon to the side of the road and reported his discovery to local police. By 11:17 a.m., a state highway patrolman had arrived at the scene. The registration card on the steering wheel post listed the owner as A. Coors. Within the hour, William and Joseph Coors, Ad's brothers, had been notified by telephone. The search began. Deputies and investigators fanned out across the area. In the creek below the bridge, they recovered Ad's eyeglasses, later confirmed by his ophthalmologist as matching his prescription. A resident who lived near the bridge told investigators she had heard a loud report at approximately 8 o'clock that morning, a sound she described as much louder than a .22 rifle, comparable to lightning striking a tree. Another witness, hanging laundry a mile and a half to the east, also heard a shot from the direction of the bridge around the same time. One loud crack, or possibly 2, so close together, they sounded as one. The following morning, February 10th, Mary Coors received a typewritten letter in the mail. It bore no return address. The text was precise, clinical, free of errors. Mrs. Coors, your husband has been kidnapped. His car is by Turkey Creek. Call the police or FBI. He dies. Cooperate. He lives. Ransom, $200 in tens and $300 in 20s. There will be no negotiating. The letter instructed her to place the money in a suitcase, take out a classified advertisement in the Denver Post offering a tractor for sale, and wait for further instructions at a specified telephone number. It used the pronoun we, implying multiple kidnappers. It promised Ad would be released unharmed within 48 hours of payment. It closed with a warning: Adolf's life is in your hands. We have no desire to commit murder. All we want is that money. The FBI's Denver division entered the case that same day, invoking the federal kidnapping statute. Adolf Coors Jr., who had been finishing a vacation in Hawaii, flew home immediately and began assembling the ransom, $500,000, in used non-consecutive unmarked bills, secured from a Boston bank and delivered overnight to Golden. The family placed the classified advertisement as instructed. They waited by the telephone. No call came, no further contact. The silence stretched into days, then weeks. The FBI launched the largest manhunt since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, deploying agents across the country. J. Edgar Hoover himself took a personal interest in the case. On February 17th, 8 days after the disappearance, a fire chief in Atlantic City, New Jersey, discovered a burned-out canary yellow 1951 Mercury sedan at a dump site. Investigators scraped a caked-on substance from the vehicle's undercarriage, soil with traces of rare pink feldspar and granite minerals consistent with the Turkey Creek area. Inside the charred remains, they found a Royalite portable typewriter. Analysis confirmed it was the machine used to type the ransom note, the letter S printed slightly lower than the other characters, a distinctive flaw. The car was traced to a Denver resident named Walter Osborne, who had purchased it on January 9, 1960, exactly 1 month before the kidnapping. Osborne had moved out of his Capitol Hill apartment on February 10th, the day after the abduction, telling his landlady he was leaving to finish his degree in Boulder. Neighbors recalled hearing him typing late at night in the weeks before his departure. Walter Osborne, investigators discovered, did not exist. The name was an alias for Joseph Corbett, Jr., a 31-year-old former Fulbright scholar who had escaped from a California prison in 1955 while serving a sentence for second-degree murder. On March 30, 1960, the FBI added Corbett to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. But there was no body. For 7 months, Coors remained missing, presumed dead by investigators, hoped alive by his family. Spring came and went. Summer passed. Mary Coors lived in a limbo between grief and faith, surrounded by armed guards, waiting for word that never arrived. Then, on September 11, 1960, a hiker named Edward Lee Green, Jr. stumbled upon a pair of trousers in a remote wooded area 12 miles southwest of Sedalia, near Pikes Peak. In the pocket, he found a key ring with a small penknife, engraved with the initials ASI. 4 days later, investigators recovered additional clothing, skeletal remains, and a skull in the same area. The jacket and shirt bore 2 bullet holes in the back. An examination of a shoulder bone confirmed the trajectory. Dental records provided the final identification. Adolf Coors III had been dead since the morning he disappeared, shot twice in the back, his body dumped in the wilderness, and left to the elements and the animals. The official reconstruction assembled itself from circumstantial evidence. Corbett had stalked Coors for months, studying his routines, noting the isolated bridge he crossed each morning. On February 9th, Corbett parked his yellow Mercury on the bridge, feigning mechanical trouble. When Ad stopped to help, Corbett produced a weapon and attempted to force him into the car at gunpoint. Handcuffs and leg irons had been purchased in advance. Packaging was later found in a dumpster outside Corbett's apartment. But something went wrong. Ad Coors, 6 feet 2 inches tall, athletic, a former semi-professional baseball player, did not comply. He fought back. He broke free and tried to reach his own vehicle. Corbett fired twice, striking him in the back. The kidnapping had failed before it began. The ransom note, already typed and ready to mail, became meaningless the moment the trigger was pulled. And yet Corbett mailed it anyway, the following day, after Ad was already dead. He collected no money. He fled east, burned his car, and spent 8 months on the run before being recognized from a Reader's Digest photograph by neighbors in Vancouver, British Columbia. When police knocked on his hotel room door on October 29, 1960, he answered with 5 words: "I give up. I'm the man you want." The pieces fit. The evidence was overwhelming. The conviction was all but certain. And still the questions lingered. Why had a man who planned so meticulously, who had researched kidnapping techniques, purchased restraints, typed a flawless ransom note, allowed the encounter to spiral into violence within seconds? Why had he mailed the note after the murder, knowing no exchange could ever take place? Why had Ad Coors, a man raised in a family shadowed by kidnapping fears since 1933, stopped alone on a deserted bridge to help a stranger in a yellow car he had reportedly seen lurking near his property in the weeks before? The trial would provide answers. The jury would deliberate. The verdict would come. But certainty, in cases like this, is never complete. The trial began on March 13, 1961, in Jefferson County District Court in Golden, Colorado, the same town where the Coors Brewery had operated for nearly 90 years. It lasted 13 days. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Ronald J. Hardesty, presented a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the killing. The defendant never confessed. The body had been discovered 7 months after death, reduced to skeletal remains scattered across a remote dump site near Sedalia. The FBI contributed 23 agents, 5 laboratory examiners, and a fingerprint expert. The evidence they assembled was formidable. The typewriter recovered from Corbett's burned-out Mercury, its distinctive flawed S, matching the ransom note character for character. The soil samples scraped from the car's undercarriage, containing rare pink feldspar and granite minerals consistent with the Turkey Creek area. The receipts for handcuffs, leg irons, and a pistol purchased in the weeks before the abduction. The testimony of witnesses who had seen a canary yellow sedan near the bridge in the days and weeks preceding February 9th. Joseph Corbett, Jr. sat quietly throughout the proceedings, hands clasped on the table before him. He did not testify in his own defense. He entered no confession, offered no explanation, provided no alternative account of his whereabouts on the morning Coors disappeared. His attorney, William Erickson, who would later be appointed to the Colorado Supreme Court, mounted a defense focused on the insufficiency of circumstantial evidence, arguing that the web of facts could have been wrapped around virtually anyone. Years later, Erickson would confirm that everything Corbett told him during the trial preparation was accurate, at least insofar as he was able to investigate. There was, he acknowledged, a strange moment during the defense. Corbett had described 2 potential alibi witnesses, a man and his son, who were prepared to testify that Corbett had been at a gas station having his car repaired on the morning of the kidnapping. But Corbett himself refused to call them. "That's just not true," he told his attorney. "Someone may have been at that gas station, but it wasn't me." The alibi witnesses were never summoned. The jury deliberated for more than 16 hours, a duration that suggested division, uncertainty, the possibility of a hung verdict. In the end, they convicted Corbett of first-degree murder. Judge Christian D. Stoner sentenced him to life imprisonment. Corbett's face remained impassive as the verdict was read. He would maintain his innocence for the rest of his life. The questions that emerged during the trial were never fully answered, only set aside. The prosecution's narrative held that Corbett had stalked Coors for months, had purchased restraints and a weapon, had typed a ransom note in advance, and had positioned his car on the bridge to simulate a breakdown. When Coors stopped to help, Corbett attempted to force him into the vehicle at gunpoint. Coors resisted, broke free, tried to flee, and was shot twice in the back. The kidnapping failed. The murder was improvised. The ransom note, already prepared, was mailed the following day out of, what? Desperation? Denial? A refusal to accept that the plan had collapsed? But this reconstruction raised its own inconsistencies. Corbett had an IQ of 148. He was a former Fulbright scholar, a man who had studied kidnapping techniques with academic rigor, who had researched the Lindbergh case obsessively, who had planned the abduction for months. How had such a methodical mind allowed the encounter to spiral into violence within seconds? Why had he not anticipated resistance from a man 6 feet 2 inches tall, athletic, a former semi-professional baseball player? Why had he brought a pistol if his intention was to take Coors alive? And why, after the murder, had he mailed the ransom note at all? The letter demanded $500,000 for a man who was already dead. It promised release within 48 hours of payment, a promise that could never be kept. It used the pronoun we, implying accomplices who did not exist. If Corbett was the calculating criminal the prosecution described, why had he committed an act so transparently futile? The family's behavior in the aftermath raised questions of a different kind. Adolph Coors, Jr., the patriarch, had been vacationing in Hawaii when his son disappeared. He returned immediately, assembled the ransom, placed the classified advertisement as instructed. But in the weeks and months that followed, He and his wife Alice appeared to distance themselves from Mary Coors and her children. Bill and Joe, Ad's brothers, returned to work at the brewery the day after the disappearance, maintaining operations as though nothing had changed. The outward stoicism struck some observers as coldness, a refusal to grieve publicly, or perhaps an inability to grieve at all. Mary Coors descended into heavy drinking in the years after her husband's death. She sold the Morrison Ranch for $200,000 within months of the murder. Her eldest daughter, Mary Brooke, died of cancer in 1968 at the age of 26. Mary herself died in 1975 at 60, following a fall at a friend's home in Aspen. The family that had been shattered on Turkey Creek Bridge never fully reconstituted itself. Corbett served 19 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary at Canyon City. He was a model prisoner, quiet, bookish, compliant. In 1978 and again in subsequent years, Adolph Coors IV, Ad's son, visited the prison seeking a meeting. Corbett refused each time. On his final visit, the younger Coors tucked a note into a Bible and handed it to a guard. "I want to forgive you for what you did to my family, and I ask for your forgiveness for the hatred we've had for you all these years." Corbett never responded. At his parole hearing in 1979, Corbett offered a statement that would echo for decades. "I see myself as a pretty commonplace man who, through sheer bizarre circumstances, got involved in something notorious." He was released on December 12, 1980, after nearly 2 decades behind bars. In 1996, 36 years after the murder, Corbett granted his only interview. He was 67 years old, living alone in a small apartment in southwest Denver, drapes pinned shut, telephone disconnected to avoid crank callers. He spoke of his fascination with the Lindbergh case, how Bruno Hauptmann had gone to the electric chair proclaiming his innocence, how the case remained controversial for years. He spoke of the circumstantial evidence that had convicted him. The web, he insisted, could have ensnared anyone. He did not attempt to prove his innocence. "It would be futile to retry the case now," he said. "What's the point? It just goes against all my instincts, all my conditioning. To say anything at all now that would add to my notoriety." He died on August 24, 2009, in that same apartment, 10 miles from Turkey Creek Bridge. He was 80 years old. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound, self-inflicted. He had been diagnosed with cancer. He had no family to speak of. The morning paper, wrapped in a yellow-green plastic bag, lay untouched outside his door. He took whatever truth he possessed with him. The murder changed everything, and nothing. The day after Ad Coors disappeared, his brothers Bill and Joe returned to work at the Golden Brewery. Operations continued without interruption. Production schedules were maintained. The trucks rolled out on time. It was, in its way, the most Coors response imaginable. Grief converted to labor, silence substituted for mourning. The family had always believed that survival meant endurance, and endurance meant discipline. They had survived prohibition by making malted milk and ceramics. They would survive this by making beer. But the cracks were already forming. Adolph Coors Jr., the patriarch, was 76 years old when his firstborn son was killed. He had spent his life building the empire his father had founded, had weathered the kidnapping threat of 1933, had maintained the family's iron grip on every aspect of the business. Now that grip began to close tighter still. In the months after the murder, he and his wife Alice appeared to distance themselves from Mary Coors and her children. The reasons were never publicly explained. Perhaps they blamed her for something, for the ranch, for the isolation, for the quiet back road that had made their son vulnerable. Perhaps they simply could not bear to look at the family that remained. Mary Coors sold the Morrison Ranch within months of Ad's death, $200,000 for 480 acres, for the Black Angus cattle her husband had loved, for the house decorated in her old money style of antique chairs and oriental rugs. She moved back to Denver with her 4 children. The company paid her a monthly pension of $3,400. It was a comfortable sum. It was also, in its way, a severance. She began drinking heavily. Her eldest daughter, Mary Brooke, died of cancer in 1968 at the age of 26. Mary herself died in 1975 at 60, following a fall at a friend's home in Aspen. The coroner ruled it an accident. The family did not elaborate. Adolf Coors IV was 14 years old when his father was murdered. He had cried himself to sleep for months, waiting for news that never came. When the skeletal remains were finally identified, something inside him calcified. For years he carried a hatred so consuming it shaped his every thought. Joseph Corbett became the axis around which his anger turned. In 1975, 15 years after the killing, Adolf IV became a born-again Christian. The conversion did not dissolve his hatred. It only made him aware of it as a burden. He prayed for release. He struggled. He divested himself of his interest in the family beer business, unable to reconcile his faith with the product that had built the dynasty. And then, claiming the Spirit's presence, he drove to the Colorado State Penitentiary at Canyon City. He visited 3 times between 1978 and 1980. Each time, Corbett refused to see him. On his final visit, knowing he would be turned away again, Adolf IV tucked a note into a Bible and handed it to a prison guard. The inscription read, "I'm here to see you today, and I'm sorry that we could not meet. As a Christian, I am summoned by our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to forgive. I do forgive you, and I ask for your forgiveness for the hatred we've had for you all these years." Corbett never responded. He was released 2 years later on December 12, 1980, after serving 19 years. He drove a truck for the Salvation Army until he retired. He lived alone in a small apartment in southwest Denver, 10 miles from Turkey Creek Bridge, drapes pinned shut, telephone disconnected. He died by his own hand on August 24, 2009, a single gunshot to the head. He was 80 years old and had been diagnosed with cancer. Adolf IV never returned to the brewery. He became an evangelical speaker, traveling the country to share his testimony of forgiveness. He had chosen a different path, one that led away from Golden, away from the mansion, away from the weight of the name. He was, in this sense, the final Adolf Coors to helm the corporation, even though he never held the title. The line ended with him. Control passed to his uncles. Bill Coors, the middle brother, had wanted to be a violinist. Joe Coors, the youngest, had wanted something else, though what exactly he never said. Both had succumbed to what they called the family responsibility. Now they ran the empire together, Bill overseeing brewing operations, Joe managing the porcelain division, and increasingly, the family's political interests. It was Joe who would become the face of the Coors name in the decades that followed, though not for the beer. In 1973, he provided a $250,000 grant to help found the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank that would become one of the most influential policy organizations in Washington. He became an advisor to Ronald Reagan, a supporter of the Contras in Nicaragua, a funder of causes that ranged from anti-union campaigns to opposition to civil rights legislation. The brewery's policies reflected his convictions: polygraph tests for employees, loyalty oaths, drug screening, a fierce resistance to unionization that dated back to the founders' era. The company's politics made it a target. In April 1977, the Brewery Workers' Union went on strike. Coors kept operating with supervisors and a fraction of union members who crossed the picket line. The AFL-CIO launched a boycott that would last a decade. Mexican Americans charged the company with discriminatory hiring practices and joined the boycott in the late 1960s. Gay rights activists followed after allegations that the company had used polygraphs to screen out homosexual employees. The coalition of opponents grew: labor unions, civil rights organizations, feminist groups, Hispanic activists, LGBT advocates. For 30 years, from the late 1950s through 1987, Coors faced sustained, organized resistance from constituencies that viewed the company as a symbol of everything they opposed. The boycotts did not destroy the company, but they constrained its growth, limited its markets, forced it to remain regional when competitors were going national. By the time the AFL-CIO ended its boycott in 1987, after negotiations with Pete Coors, Joe's son, the damage had been absorbed into the corporate bloodstream. Coors was no longer the upstart challenger. It was the embattled incumbent, fighting to hold ground in a consolidating industry. Pete Coors represented the fourth generation. He was the great-grandson of the founder, educated at Phillips Exeter and Cornell like his forebears, trained in every aspect of the business. In 1993, he became vice chairman and CEO, the first family member to hold the top position in decades. He was more moderate than his father, defending the company's extension of benefits to same-sex partners as good business separate from politics. In 2004, he ran for the United States Senate from Colorado on the Republican ticket. He lost to Democrat Ken Salazar by 4 percentage points. That same year, Coors announced its intention to merge with Molson, the Canadian brewing giant. The deal closed on February 9, 2005, 45 years to the day after Coors disappeared on Turkey Creek Bridge. The company was renamed Molson Coors Brewing Company. Pete Coors stepped aside as chairman. Eric Molson, representing the Canadian family, took the helm. The merger was billed as a union of equals. In practice, it was an acknowledgement that the Coors family could no longer compete alone. The global beer industry was consolidating at unprecedented speed. Anheuser-Busch InBev, SAB Miller, Heineken. The giants were swallowing everything in their path. A family-owned regional brewery, no matter how storied, could not survive on nostalgia and quality alone. The Coors family retained voting influence through a dual-class share structure. The Molson family held equal power. Control, in the old sense, the absolute authority that Adolf Coors Sr. had exercised when he bought out Jacob Schuler in 1880, that Adolf Jr. had wielded when he rebuilt the company after Prohibition, was gone. The brewery remained in Golden. The mansion still stood on the grounds, but the dynasty, as a governing force, had dissolved into something more diffuse: a board of directors, institutional shareholders, quarterly earnings calls. Adolf Coors III had been the last of the founding line to run the company, as a family patriarch might. His murder did not cause the decline that followed, but it marked the moment when the family's grip began to loosen, when the silences that had always defined them became fractures, when the weight of the name became heavier than the will to carry it. The beer is still brewed in Golden. The mansion still stands behind its fence, visible from Highway 58, closed to the public. The family's story continues in fragments: a senator who lost an election, a speaker who found forgiveness, a company that merged to survive. What ended on that bridge was not the Coors empire. It was the belief that the empire could remain whole. Part 8. What remains? The mansion still stands. It sits on the brewery grounds in Golden, Colorado, surrounded by pine trees and manicured lawns, almost hidden behind the towering steel and concrete structures of the modern production complex. From Highway 58, you can glimpse it if you know where to look. A Victorian anachronism, cream-colored walls and classical columns, Palladian windows catching the afternoon light. It looks like something that wandered in from another century and forgot to leave. The brewery offers tours now. 90 minutes, $20 for adults. Reservations required. Hundreds of thousands of visitors pass through each year, shuttled from the parking lot on 14th Street to the production facilities where 20 million barrels of beer flow annually. They see the malting process, the brewing tanks, the packaging lines. They sample Coors Light and Blue Moon in the hospitality lounge. They browse neon signs and historical memorabilia in the gift shop. They do not see the mansion. Only members of the family are allowed inside. That rule has held for over a century, since the days when Adolf Coors Sr. built the house as a gift to his wife Louisa, incorporating pieces of the old dance pavilion and beer garden that had once welcomed the public. The transformation was deliberate, from open to closed, from celebration to seclusion. The mansion was never meant to be shared. A former employee who toured the interior in 1976 described what he saw: 22 rooms retaining their original design and decor, bookshelves filled with German-language volumes in the library, oriental rugs spread across hardwood floors, handcrafted furniture arranged as though awaiting occupants who never returned. The Copenhagen chandelier still hung from the high ceiling. The Steinway piano still waited in the music room. A round table near the founder's favorite easy chair still concealed a radio, a technological marvel when it was installed, now a relic of an era when wireless sound seemed like magic. The cottages that once housed family members are gone, demolished to make way for brewery expansion. The mansion itself was moved 300 feet and rotated 90 degrees in 1961, the year after Ad Coors was murdered, the year Joseph Corbett was convicted. The family could not bring themselves to tear down what the founder had built, so they lifted it whole and set it down again, facing Castle Rock now instead of the production buildings, a house that had been uprooted and replanted like the family itself. What the tourists see is the brewery. What they do not see is the silence that hangs behind the fence, in the rooms where the chandelier still catches light from windows that no longer look out on what they once did. The house is a museum without visitors, a monument to a family that preferred to be forgotten. The murder lives in other forms now. It surfaces in the cultural memory the way old crimes do, flattened into entertainment, stripped of ambiguity, packaged for consumption. The Forensic Files episode is called Bitter Brew. It runs 22 minutes and focuses on the soil evidence, the pink feldspar and granite minerals that tied Corbett's mercury to Turkey Creek. The science is compelling. The human cost is condensed into narration. Philip Jett's 2017 book, The Death of an Heir, Adolf Coors III, and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty, reconstructs the crime in meticulous detail. It quotes from trial transcripts, FBI reports, newspaper archives. It follows Corbett from his childhood in Seattle, through his escape from San Quentin, to his years as Walter Osborne in Denver. It tells the story the way true crime demands, with tension, revelation, resolution. What it cannot tell is what Corbett knew, what he might have said if he had spoken, what really happened in those seconds on the bridge when a plan that had been months in the making collapsed into violence. The family does not discuss the murder publicly. Molson Coors, the corporation that now owns the brewery, declined comment when journalists have asked. The silence is institutional now, embedded in corporate policy, the way it was once embedded in family custom. The Coors name appears on stadium signs, and beer cans, and Super Bowl commercials. It does not appear in interviews about what happened on February 9, 1960. Turkey Creek still flows through the canyon southeast of Morrison. The bridge where Ad Coors stopped his travelall has been replaced, rebuilt, modernized. The road is paved now, no longer the rutted gravel track that Corbett chose for its isolation. Houses dot the hillsides. The area is suburban, accessible, ordinary. Nothing marks the spot where a man was shot twice in the back for the contents of a ransom note that was mailed after he was already dead. The dump near Sedalia where the remains were found has been reclaimed, covered over, absorbed into the landscape. The hikers who discovered the trousers with the monogrammed penknife are long gone. Edward Lee Green Jr., the pizza delivery man, whose accidental discovery ended 7 months of uncertainty, left no public record of what it meant to find the bones of a man whose disappearance had captivated a nation. Coors' remains were cremated shortly after identification. His ashes were scattered over Aspen Mountain, far from Golden, far from the brewery, far from the mansion where his grandfather had lived and his father had raised him, and his brothers had shared a single office with 3 metal desks. It was, perhaps, the only escape the family could give him, a dispersal into wind and snow, a release from the weight of the name. The mansion remains. The brewery remains. The beer remains. Coors Banquet, Coors Light, Blue Moon, Keystone, the brands that built an empire and survived its transformation into something larger and less personal. The family retains voting influence through a dual-class share structure, their power diluted but not extinguished, their presence felt in boardrooms, if not in daily operations. What does not remain is the certainty that once defined them, the founder who arrived as a stowaway and built a fortune from nothing, the son who survived prohibition and a kidnapping plot and poured 17,000 gallons of beer into Clear Creek rather than break the law, the grandson who wanted only to raise cattle on a ranch in Morrison and crossed a bridge every morning until one morning he didn't. The story has become folklore now, repeated in podcast episodes and Wikipedia entries and walking tours of Golden, where guides share tales the official Coors tour does not tell. It has been simplified, dramatized, packaged for audiences who will never see the inside of the mansion or understand what it meant to carry that name. But the house still stands. The chandelier still hangs. The piano still waits. And somewhere in the walls, in the silence between the German books and the Oriental rugs, the weight of everything that happened and everything that was never explained remains. They came to America with nothing. They changed their names, buried their pasts, built empires from clear mountain water and silence. They taught their children that survival meant discipline, that trust was a liability, that the only safety lay in control of the product, the process, the family, the story. For 4 generations, the Coors name meant something singular: a brewery in Golden, a mansion on the grounds, a family that answered to no one. They endured prohibition and boycotts and a murder that should have broken them. They endured because endurance was all they knew. But empires are not inherited. They are rebuilt or they dissolve. The founders' great-great-grandchildren sit on boards now, hold shares, attend meetings. The beer still flows. The mansion still stands. The silence still holds. What remains is not the dynasty. It is the question the dynasty could never answer. What does it cost to carry a name that was never yours to begin with? A name borrowed from a ship's manifest, stripped of its original spelling, passed down through generations who never spoke of where it came from or what was lost along the way. The house keeps its secrets. The family keeps its distance. The story continues, not because anyone is telling it, but because no one ever finished. Some things once begun do not end. They only wait.